Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this Dispatch from the Front. Sometimes culture wars turn hot, and we're seeing that as this is being recorded today with the outbreak of violence across a number of American cities in the wake of the death of George Floyd. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the Floyd event here, but I do want to talk about something that's kind of ancillary to that. This story is from Vox. Headline, Police Targeted Journalists Covering the George Floyd Protests. Though police were responsible for most of the violence, some protesters got in on the act too. This is by Caitlin Burns. On Friday night, this story is from May 31st. Photojournalist Linda Tirado was shot in the eye by a rubber bullet while covering an anti-police brutality protest in Minneapolis. One of the more than 24 incidents of journalists experiencing violence while covering the recent demonstrations. Tirado says she's permanently blind in her left eye. She is thankful she uses her right eye to take photos so the injury is not career-ending. The Minneapolis Police Department and Mayor Jacob Fry's office didn't respond to requests for comment about Tirado's injury. Across the country, journalists have been targeted by police, facing arrest, detention, and violence, including being pepper sprayed and shot by rubber bullets. Journalists were targeted by police in the Ferguson protests in 2015 and during the Civil Rights era, and that pattern of violence and arrest continued into this weekend's protests. Targeted attacks on journalists, media crews, and news organizations covering the demonstration show a complete disregard for their critical role in documenting issues of public interest and are an unacceptable attempt to intimidate them, said Carlos Martinez de la Serna, program director at the nonprofit agency group Committee to Protect Journalists, in a statement Saturday. Authorities in cities across the U.S. need to instruct police not to target journalists and to ensure they can report safely on the protests without fear of injury or retaliation. Police shot at journalists with rubber bullets. A reporter and her camera crew were shot by police in Louisville. Vox's Alex Ward has more detailed coverage of that Louisville incident. Ali Valshi and his MSNBC camera crew were shot at by Minneapolis police live on the air while covering a peaceful protest. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation journalist Susan Ormiston was hit with rubber bullets and tear gas fired by Minneapolis police live on the air Saturday. 2 members of the Reuters TV camera crew were hit by rubber bullets in Minneapolis Saturday. And so on and so on. There are several more examples here. And there's, in addition to rubber bullets, they talk about tear gas and pepper spray. You can read the rest of the article. So there's a couple of things to say here. And we've got a couple of cultures that are competing, one of which is kind of the unspoken culture. First off, we have the culture being represented by Vox here, which is the notion that journalists are special. You notice in the story as we go through, the sympathy in the story is all with the journalists. They were hit by rubber bullets here. Police targeted them there. And that's fine. But then you have to step back and ask yourself the question, well, who defines who is and who is not a journalist? And there's a wider issue that's going on right now where that distinction is very much in play. Are you a journalist because you work for a company that produces journalism? That's the tack that Vox is taking. There was an earlier incident where journalists were arrested, and then the Minneapolis police had to apologize for arresting those journalists. Well, let's think about it a little bit. You're out in the middle of a melee where people are destroying property, setting fires, looting. How are the police to know that you're a journalist or not? How do they know that you're not part of the crowd that's engaging in these activities that they are rounding people up for. Well, they don't. And anyone can claim that they are a journalist. Everyone has iPhones. Lots of people have cameras. And it has to be sorted out. So it was interesting to me that the Minneapolis police apologized to journalists before they apologized to the family of the man who was killed by police, which started off these protests. It shows you what they value. We live in an age where journalism, the recording of events, the reporting of what is going on, is not confined to people who have access to a printing press. This whole event started because a citizen had a phone on which they recorded the police kneeling on the neck of Mr. Floyd. And it was that video which went viral and created the furor over this event. That was not video that was provided by CNN. It was not photos provided by the New York Times. This was someone on the scene as events were happening, a citizen journalist, if you will. And if that person had been arrested by the police, would they have the protections that are being honored with regard to the, quote, professional journalist? And the answer is, in the United States of America at this time, clearly not. Clearly not. But the professional media class values their privileges more than they do getting out the facts. And we know this because while this is all going on, the professional media journalist companies have an alliance with the big tech platform companies, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and the like, to censor information which does not come from them. Their competition, in other words. When YouTube was launched, the great thing about YouTube was that it allowed for a nation, in effect, of content providers. We were no longer limited by the four major companies that own all the media in the United States of America. That allowed for a proliferation of voices. That proliferation of voices was something that used to be a core American value not that long ago. Freedom of speech was sacrosanct. There were very few exceptions to where freedom of speech would not be honored. What this lockdown has exposed, and it's not just during the pandemic, it's been coming for a while, is that increasingly freedom of speech in the United States of America is not valued. The tack that is currently being taken is to define anything, any speech, which is in disagreement with the received narrative from those media companies, to be misinformation, to be false. Initially, they did this with so-called fact checkers who were always of a same mind as to those media companies with regard to what policy ought to be implemented in the nation. But now it's being done by being coded into algorithms which prevent that information from ever being seen. Moreover, in another cultural earthquake, those big tech companies were originally founded in order to make free speech even freer. That was the founding vision of them. That is no longer the case. We first saw signs of this when Google agreed to build censorship software into its search engine at the behest of communist China. Now, they backed off publicly on that project, but we hear that it's still gone on. And indeed, we're seeing in this algorithm, which censors content in YouTube and through search engines, we see that that project is not being applied just in China anymore. It's being applied in the US. And if you want to test it out for yourself, simply open up a browser window, one with Google search engine in it, the other with an alternate search engine, DuckDuckGo, Bing, something like that. Run a search on a controversial topic, and then note the page where you first see something which disagrees with Google's take on that topic. You're going to see exactly how they bury these things, if you can find alternate views on it at all. Google clearly no longer values free speech and the free access to information. A hidden value has replaced that value. And that hidden value is conformity with a prevailing narrative. You can figure out for yourself what that prevailing narrative is. It requires simply paying a little bit of attention and then just looking for the alternate to that to see how Google does this. But the bottom line of it is that the media has aligned itself with big tech not to advance the cause under the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States to a free press and freedom of speech, but to limit it. In other words, not all American citizens have free speech. They ensure they do, who have been filtered ideologically, do. And that is who they're protecting when you see articles like this. Let's talk about the second culture that's in competition and tension here. And that is the culture of police departments across the United States. There's a very well-known cultural value that these police departments have, which is never written down, but widely known to be held. And you can see it in this case. And that is the culture of the long blue line. For those not familiar, policemen in the United States have long been associated with the color blue in their uniforms. So when they say the long blue line, that's another way of saying all policemen. And one of those values associated with the long blue line is that policemen protect each other and they do not testify against one another. So if a policeman gets up to no good, and the policeman in question here has a long history of complaints of police brutality, they protect that policeman. When you see the video and the photographs of what was done to Mr. Floyd, you will notice that he is kneeling on Floyd's neck while 3 other policemen are kneeling on the rest of his body to hold him down. He is handcuffed. He's pressed up against the ground and up against the vehicle. Those 3 other policemen didn't stop the policeman in question here from kneeling on Floyd's airway. When Floyd complained that he couldn't breathe, they didn't stop that policeman from continuing to kneel on his airway. That is the culture of the long blue line. When riots broke out in Minneapolis, A large cadre of Minneapolis's riot police was not out in the streets protecting local businesses. They were surrounding the home of that police officer to protect his home. Now, he killed a man, but they protected him. Those business owners hadn't killed anybody, hadn't done anything, and they did not get that protection. So what does that tell you about the values of the police department? Well, nothing good. The most common publicly stated value in police departments across the United States is protect and serve. Who are they to protect? The implication is it's the public. Who are they to serve? Again, it's the public, the community. And yet, when push came to shove, who did they protect and who did they serve? In Minneapolis, in this incident, it was rather clear. And I would argue that Minneapolis is not unique in this regard. So we have the values of the police in protecting their own, even when they're up to no good in criminal activity, versus the values of the media in getting the story, getting the truth out to such extent as they hold it. But in reality, the value of the media is truly in access. And by that I mean they are worried about continuing access to things that the police can tell them. So how do you know a crime has been committed? How did they find out about Mr. Floyd? Chances are they were monitoring the police radio. If it was called over the radio, I don't know that for a fact that it was. They were not on the street when this happened. So they had to find out about it. And they typically rely on first responders, not just police, but firefighters and EMTs for that kind of information. That's how they find out about the story. Sometimes they'll get an anonymous tip, but that can be hit or miss. So in this conflict between police brutality and the media, there's some conflict, but it's a little bit muted by the media's need to maintain access. The media, in the prevailing narrative, also has a conflicting value in that they wish to be seen as on the side of civil rights. So the fact that Mr. Floyd is a black man and that the cop who was kneeling on his windpipe was a white man, although the other cops were of diverse races, doesn't really do anything but fan the flames from a media perspective for this story. So the media is in a little bit of a quandary. It would be easier if this had been done by some local yokel. It would be easier for them. They have a third problem, which is that the media gets its prevailing narrative from the government. The government in Minneapolis is controlled by the party that the media favors, the political party. So they don't want to push the narrative too far with regard to systematized corruption. Amy Klobuchar is a former presidential candidate and considered to be a vice presidential candidate from that party. She was the attorney, the prosecuting attorney, who declined to prosecute this same police officer when previously accused of police brutality. That is a story that the media really does not want to cover because of their conflicting values. In addition to what we've talked about, Amy Klobuchar is a female, And one of the media values is they would like to see a female president of the United States sooner rather than later. She was a viable candidate. If she managed to become vice president, she would be. Even if she weren't, even if the campaign didn't succeed, that just strengthens her presidential bid next time around. It potentially accelerates the chance to get a female president of the United States, which is something that the media dearly holds and values. So you can see kind of the tendrils of these conflicting values in play here, which makes the coverage difficult for the media because they have to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things. Now let's talk about the culture that's not being directly addressed here. And I would call that culture the American culture. The culture of values held by your typical American citizen from time immemorial almost. And that is this: when we see a police officer kneeling on a man's neck and 3 other police officers kneeling on them, it is not predominantly a racial issue, although certainly race can factor into it. What we see is the government abusing its power. What we see are government officials acting in the fashion that they ascribe to the people that they're bringing into custody. What we see is not George Floyd, a black man, on that pavement, but we see ourselves, whatever race we may be. And we realize that there is no court of appeal if someone decides to press down on your throat for an extended period of time. What consolation is it to George Floyd's family that we have protests? They've paid the price. He's paid the price. And in the context of the wider pandemic and the lockdowns that we've got, where the citizenry has seen unprecedented assaults on, among other things, their First Amendment rights. There is no freedom to assembly right now, which is in the Constitution and protected. There is no freedom of religion right now, which is in the Constitution and protected. And there is no freedom of speech right now because anyone who complains about this assault on our freedoms is being censored, if not banned, from the platforms. And since lockdowns are the prevailing condition in much of the country, and since we can't get together physically, what avenue does anyone have to complain about this turn of events? The only avenue really left to us is those online platforms. And so what we see as American citizens is a widespread, comprehensive assault on our liberties, which we as American citizens value. There are few peoples on the face of the earth who value freedom more than Americans do. And yet you notice that, for the reasons elucidated earlier, you don't see that perspective in these media reports. Much of the rioting and looting, I would argue, is not because, as the media tends to like to portray it, you have one of two conditions. Either people are just taking advantage of the situation to get free stuff because they value free stuff, or people are righteously indignant because of race relations in the United States of America. And it's really the non-white people having just furious at white people. That's not what you see when you see the actual pictures of these demonstrations, because it doesn't largely break down upon racial lines. And I would argue that the reason that is because what we're actually seeing is Americans coming together to say we are not being heard. The people who are making these decisions regarding the lockdowns, regarding the decision to prosecute or not prosecute criminal police officers, the people who are making these decisions are completely unaccountable for them. They are protected in the law. They cannot be personally sued for it. They are protected in fact because the party to which they belong protects them, shields them from criticism, shields them from consequences. And sure, it might set back a political career or two if the stink is great enough, but the bottom line of it is that the average American citizen, the person who is down on that pavement with their face pressed against an automobile tire, they do not have the same privileges. We have created a system wherein if you belong to the elite, and the way you show that you belong to their elite is that you broadcast somehow, you signal that you share their values. It's like a secret handshake. Once they know you share their values, you get the privileges. Now, there's a hierarchy. So the typical foot soldier who just pulls the ballot lever repeatedly for that favored group of people, well, they'll get something, but not quite as much as the people who are actually determining what the favored narrative is will get. So what we're seeing, I think, in America at this moment is the clash in reality, not of people who have journalistic values versus people who have police values, but the clash between a governmental elite, which has come to dominate the institutions in this country over the past generation, and the common citizenry. The common citizen still holds to those time-honored American values that their parents had. There is no longer any institution in this country which represents the common citizen. And for that reason, the common citizen is feeling oppressed and getting angry about it, because one of the values that they deeply hold is the love for liberty and freedom. And that is precisely what the elite is taking away from them. It remains to see how that battle will play out. But I think we already see that there are alliances being forged which are different than the prevailing narrative would predict. And I think at the end of the day, history shows us that elites can only ride herd on the common citizenry for so long. There simply are not enough of them, and there are simply too many of their opponent. So over the long term, it's unlikely that the elite values are going to prevail over those of the common citizen here in the United States. At least I hope so. No secret from this podcast, you'll see that I am far more sympathetic to the views of the common citizen in America than I am toward either the views of the media or the views of the police, or by extension, the views of the government. My only hope is that I'm not alone in that view, and that this discussion will reach you without the filter of censorship along the way. We live in an interesting time, my friends, and I hope as you keep an eye on events, you don't lose sight of the interplay of cultural values in those events. Because as we know, history is one thing, but culture is everything. Thank you and have a great day.